Hello, and welcome to episode 433 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. Happy New Year, Bill, on this January the 8th.
Happy New Year to you, Seth, as well. You know, my daughter and I drove down from Virginia. She spent a few days with us down here in Florida, and we were running away from that horrible winter storm. We stayed ahead of the snow, which was wonderful. We got down here in Florida, and it was a balmy 70 degrees. That was yesterday. This morning, I got up and it was 40 degrees. I had to put the park on. Seth, it's like Antarctica in 2015. Oh no, it was way colder in Antarctica. But now that I'm spoiled Floridian, it sure felt like that.
It's been cold last couple days here. The wind chill yesterday here at Camp Shelby was 25 degrees.
Wow.
That's cold. That's cold. I'm sorry. I don't care where you are. That's cold.
Yep.
And
hey, I'm really looking forward. Yeah. Really looking forward to this episode today, Seth. But I want a teaser in here because at the end of this episode, folks, we're going to have a great reveal of something that our friend Richard Frank told me. But you've got to listen all the way to the end to find out what that reveal is all about. And as this episode is going to be air about the time we're in San Diego, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, if it does, you might have heard this story from Richard Frank himself if you're going to attend the convention in San Diego, the Western Naval History Association conference at the USS Midway, because Richard Frank is going to reveal this himself, but we may do it in parallel with him.
Yeah, I don't know if Rich is actually going to be there, or if he's going to do it virtually, but either way, it's still going to be anything Rich says is gospel. So I mean, he's the grand poobah, as we call him. So
good,
the grand poobah. So with that, let's get on with the show, shall we? So he was their greatest champion, their leader, their advocate, their voice, their protector, and their biggest cheerleader. He was an innovator, a fighter, a brilliant tactician, and a humble force of nature. He presided over one of the single deadliest naval campaigns in all of human history. He was the architect of the strangulation, the executioner of the unrestricted plan, and one of the most influential admirals to ever wear gold braid in the long and storied history of the United States Navy. Yet despite all of these adjectives, he is rarely mentioned amongst the great American admirals of World War II. And that is frankly wrong. Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, Mitcher, McCain, King, Leahy, Oldendorf, Kincaid, Lee, and others all come to mind when one thinks of the ranks of American admirals in World War II. Yet the one who had arguably the most profound effect, the hardest punch, the deadliest plan, and the longest lasting strategic and tactical throat punch is rarely mentioned. And for him, that'd be perfectly fine. He didn't care about himself. He cared about his men, his skippers, his XOs, his crews, his boats, and everything in between. He loved them more than he loved himself or his name and reputation. He was a true leader of men. And for that selfless attitude and utter and undying devotion to his men, they in return loved him for it. They called him Uncle Charlie. Hardly a proper name for Com Sub Pack, but it was fitting. He knew about the nickname, and he absolutely adored it. He felt that it was a reflection of his men's devotion to him and his devotion to them as they prowled the Pacific, wreaking havoc on Japan, fighting through faulty torpedoes, faulty skippers, and a proud and fearsome enemy. Uncle Charlie, better known as Admiral Charles Lockwood, was one of the most important leaders of the entire war, and the silent service under his leadership brought Japan to her knees. Bill, now I know good and well that introduction brought a tear to your eye.
You know, it did, Seth. And, you know, as you were saying all of that, I remember the hours and hours and hours over the course of many years I spent in Lockwood Hall. Go back and watch my episode where I interviewed the grandchildren of Admiral Spruance at the cemetery with Admiral Nimitz, and you'll find there's Nimitz, there's Spruance, and there's Lockwood buried together because they knew even if nobody else knows. They knew what kind of impact the three of them had on the conduct of the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Lockwood is one of my heroes, Seth.
Yeah, and and we're gonna get into the nuts and bolts of him and the things that he did and the things that he didn't necessarily do, but he led, shall we say. But he is truly, when I was writing the intro, I was thinking about it. He's one of those guys that like you don't really hear about. You hear about the skippers like Morton and O'Kane and Cutter and Lucky
Mm,
and all those guys for sure, and obviously for good reason. But you never talk about Charlie Lockwood, and he was right there, through the thick of
yeah,
it from almost from the very beginning, and he was the submarine aspect of the Pacific War cannot be understated, and we're going to do
no,
more episodes on subs. We know that, but still, goodness
yeah.
gracious, he was the man.
And Seth, we get a lot of comments about why don't you talk about torpedoes? We did an entire episode on the torpedo failures. Go back and watch, folks. We're going to talk about him again today because we're going to repeat some of the stuff that we talked about before. If it wasn't for Charlie Lockwood, this war would have lasted longer. I'm
I would
stomping my
agree.
foot on that.
I
If
would
it
agree with
wasn't
that.
for Charlie Lockwood and fixing the torpedo problem when Buord failed and resulted in the death of hundreds of submariners, those 52 submarines we lost in World War II, some of those you could lay directly at the feet of Buord.
Sure.
My active duty and civilian Department of Navy friends, listen up, because it's true. That's the kind of power and influence you could have, okay? But if it wasn't for Charlie Lockwood, a lot more Americans would have died, and frankly, a lot more Japanese, because the war would have lasted longer. So this guy is a big deal. He's the real deal. And it's right that we spend this episode on him, Seth.
Yeah. So let's get into Charlie Lockwood. So he was born in Midland, Virginia in 1890. His family moved to Missouri during his grammar school years, and as a young man, he graduated from a little high school called Lamar in 1905, and he immediately he got an appointment to the Naval Academy, and he wound up joining Annapolis, where he joined the ranks of the class of 1912. So, Bill, his early days at the academy, and this is true for all those early guys, it was on surface ships, but he had his eyes elsewhere too, though, didn't he?
Oh, from the beginning, he had to serve on surface ships and specifically served on battleships after he graduated with the class of 1912, the Mississippi and the Arkansas. Then he was assigned as an instructor for a very short period of time at where I went to boot camp when I was enlisted, Seth, Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Teaching recruits was not what Lockwood had in mind for a career. He had always set his eyes seaward, yet, unlike most of his contemporaries, his eyes weren't on the waves in the battleships that everybody thought they needed to serve on board in order to make admiral. His eyes were under the waves. And this is a day when nobody was going to make admiral serving on submarines, or as they were called, submarine torpedo boats at the time. So enamored with submarines from the start, Charlie Lockwood always knew that he wanted to spend his naval career under the water on this newfangled contraption that allowed you to be underwater for short periods of time, folks. These were gasoline-powered submarines that could stay down for a few hours in the early days, really long enough to submerge, launch it, hopefully not be seen, launch a torpedo, hopefully unseen, and then surface again before that gasoline engine risked explosion. So as soon as he was detached from his position at Great Lakes, he requested and received a transfer to the submarine tender Mohican, which was SP-177, for his first taste in submarine life. His command ability led him to the top quickly. He received command of his first boat as a lieutenant. It was called the Adder initially, and it was submarine torpedo boat A2, later SS3. It was commissioned in 1903, decommissioned in 1909, recommissioned in 1910. He graduated in 1912. And in 1914, only 2 years after graduating from the academy, he's stationed in Cavite in the Philippines as part of the Asiatic Fleet in command of this tiny, tiny submarine A2. He'd spent 2 years in command of that boat before taking command of his next submarine, B1, which was SS-10. Now, A2 was the very third submarine ever commissioned by the United States Navy, by the Holland Submarine Company. Yes, that Holland, the guy who invented the first submarine for the Americans. And by 1917, as the U.S. Navy entered World War I, Lockwood was in command of the 1st Submarine Division in the Asiatic Fleet. I think he might have been a lieutenant commander at this point, but he was only there for a year, Seth.
But think about that, what you just said. So by 1917, so this is 5 years after he graduates from the Naval Academy, the dude is in charge of a submarine division.
Right.
And that's I mean, that speaks volumes about A, the man, B, his ability, and C, the size of the submarine force. Now, Bill, and you've said this from the very first time we ever talked. The sub force is the smallest, there's more dentists than there are submariners. But it was
Submarine
even
officers.
submarine
Right.
officers, but it was he was even smaller then. So, I mean, you're
Right.
talking the itty bitty 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 part of the U.S. Navy here.
It sure wasn't. The fact that you're getting command of this submarine torpedo boat as lieutenant and command of a submarine division as a lieutenant commander shows you the low regard the battleship Navy had for these stink boats, which was correctly the way they were termed, because they really did stink. You had first initially gasoline. We talked about this before. Nimitz personally was instrumental in converting submarines from gasoline to diesel, lost a finger in the process. His ring finger, his Academy class ring, saved his ring, the rest of his finger, which is why I should be wearing mine right now. Who knows what might happen in this podcast? What kind of accidents we might have? but the very low regard the Navy had for the submarine force, these boats from the beginning were punching way above their weight class.
Mm-hmm. So Lockwood reports back to the United States from the Asiatic Fleet in 1918, and he took command of various submarines. And we're not going to go through the list because it was like 6 or 7 of them in a very short period of time at New London. One of them that he was in command of, which I thought was kind of neat, was the ex-German submarine U-97, which Lockwood was ordered to command in order to test and evaluate German submarine equipment. Obviously, this is after the end of World War I. In 1922, he was sent to China and served a hitch on the Yangtze River as flag lieutenant to Admiral William Phelps. More service aboard surface ships came from 22 to 31, with an occasional dip of the toe back into the subs mixed in those years. This was something that frankly happened to everybody, and it wasn't, it's not what he wanted. He wanted to stick within the realm of submarines, but you go where you're told. And the Navy was a small Navy in those days, and he was put in all kinds of different places aboard all kinds of different vessels. By 1935, they send Charlie Lockwood back to Annapolis, and at that point, he's an instructor on seamanship for 2 years at the academy, which is kind of a long period of time in those days for an officer of his ilk, before he winds up returning to submarines on the West Coast. In 1937, Lockwood was assigned a post within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, which is obviously, as you well know, Bill, a place where you can seriously learn how to do things right or wrong. And for Charlie Lockwood, it was the place to learn how to do things the right way by maneuvering through the sea of red tape that infested that office in those days. And as most people know, and as we're going to discuss later, that came into play in his later fight with B. Ward and other people. So the skills that he learned in that role from 37 to 39 is how long he served that would serve him well in the upcoming years. So Bill, from after he leaves that office, he winds up finding his way back into the Pacific, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He's a captain at this point, Seth. Now, the Pentagon really served, it wasn't the Pentagon yet, it was Navy headquarters. It was downtown Washington, D.C., off of the National Capital Mall, the old Navy headquarters. It really served to expose him as a senior commander and a captain to folks like Nimitz and King. They got to know who he was, which really paid huge dividends because they came to understand his organic, instinctive understanding of how to fight submarines. Because again, you didn't make promotion by being in submarines in these days. You got promoted by being in surface ships. Submarines were seen as a silly, playful, but dangerous excursion away from the real Navy. So from 39 to 41, he was in the Pacific as chief of staff to the U.S. Fleet submarine commander, Admiral William Friedel. He observed the new fleet boats coming into service for the very first time. His mind wandered about the power that these new fleet boats would have with their extended range and their increased torpedo capacity. And he got to meet some of the new young officers that were serving, the junior officers that were serving on the boats that time. He got to know, just like King and Nimitz got to know him when he was back in D.C., in this job, he got to know some dudes that would really carry the submarine force into the thick of World War II when he had the authority to assign them to bigger and better things, whose personalities and names that he would remember. And then he gets shipped off to Australia, Seth. What's up with that?
I want to touch on something you just said there that didn't occur to me until you said it. Is that, so he's in the Pacific in 1939 through 41, really, and he's there with the Fleet Submarine Commander. And that's what it was called, U.S. Fleet Submarine Commander Friedel. And he's meeting all these JOs, and these are guys who, at that time, most of them, I'd say 98% were Academy graduates. And these are guys who graduated probably 35, 36, 34, maybe 37, 38. Some of these guys he taught when he was at the academy, because he taught at the academy from 33 to 35. So he knew these guys very, very well. And as you're going to see, as we talk about some of these names, and we'll mention their graduating classes when it's appropriate. And you'll see that, yeah, he probably did teach these guys at the freaking academy, and he knew them when they got to the Pacific in 1941 as junior officers, ensigns, or JGs, or whatever the case may be. So again, banging on your point, it's a small portion of the Navy, it's a brotherhood, and they all knew one another. All these guys knew one another, every single one of them.
And let me bang on your point. While he's at the academy, he's talking up the submarine force.
Oh, for sure.
And he's telling junior officer, midshipmen, look, I know that these battleship admirals are looking down their nose at submarines, but let me tell you, midshipman Jones, just like, frankly, like Dick O'Kane did to me when I was a second-class midshipman. Let me tell you, midshipman Toady, that the submarine force is the place to be in the next war, which I thought was going to be the Cold War, duking it out with the Russians. But he's telling them in the next war, and everybody knew it was going to be Japan while he's there, right? The submarine force is going to be the organization that's going to win that war. You want to make a difference, you go submarines. I know that carried a lot of weight for a lot of these guys that would later come into command of submarines during his stint as subpac.
Absolutely. I mean, he had contact with all these guys. I mean, I'm just thinking about it right now. Dick O'Kane graduated class in 1936.
Right.
And he's teaching seamanship from 33 to 35. Well, of course he taught O'Kane. At some point, what year, I don't know. But I mean, he taught O'Kane. He knew Richard O'Kane. He knew Slade Cutter. He knew Gene Fluckey. He knew all those guys before they ever got their Dolphins, man. So, and there's no doubt that he was an influence on their choice of path, shall we say. So, following a brief stint, I do mean brief, in England as attaché and principal observer for submarines, and that's exactly what it was called, Lockwood, by then a newly minted rear admiral, was sent back to the Pacific. This is during the war now. His initial assignment was to Australia as Commander Submarine Southwest Pacific, Com Sub So West Pac, which is a mouthful to say. Lockwood, it really is. So when he gets there, and this is, as I said, this is May 1942. So this is right after the Battle of Coral Sea. So things are still kind of touch and go. So when he gets there to Australia, he inherits a force that is pretty much beaten. It is a beaten force. So a portion of the United States submarine fleet, or which was what was left of the Asiatic subforce at that time, had dispersed all over southwestern Australian ports following the collapse of Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Of course, this only happens only a few months before he gets over there. When he took command, when Lockwood takes command, only the tender Holland and 20 submarines were all that represented the command of Charlie Lockwood at that time. And most of these submarines, Bill, are not the fleet boats that we think. A lot of these are like old, raggedy old S boats. They're not the
Hmm.
Gato. I mean, there are a few Gato class here and there, but the vast majority of them are these old S boats. So when he gets down there, the morale of these guys is what you would think would be, doom and gloom, because for the most part, these guys got their butts whipped all the way from the Philippines all the way back to Australia. However, there was one scene in particular that Lockwood himself wrote about that clearly stuck with him because he remembered it, when he wrote his book. Uh, he goes into this lobby of what was called the Freemason Hotel, which at that time served as a sort of kind of an officers club for the few Americans that were in town. Um, when he goes in there, he's kind of expecting the rest of the mood to be very doom and gloom from what he'd seen so far. But these guys are all submariners. All these guys that are in there are submariners. They're all young officers. He's greeted to a raucous rendition of the popular song at that time that was popular in Australia called "Bless 'Em All."
Hmm.
And he related that it was sung at a very high volume by clearly intoxicated American submariners. And the song, as he said, was nothing if not inspirational. And it goes like this, and I'm not going to sing it, but it says, sink 'em all, Tojo and Hitler and all. Sink all their cruisers and carriers too. Sink all their tin cans and their stinking crews. And of course, it
Yeah, I
goes on
know
and
the
on.
song, Seth. It goes,
Mhm.
sink 'em all, Tojo and Hitler and all. Sink all the cruisers and carriers too. Sink all their tin cans and their stinking crews. That's the way it was. It was a song about girls. To
Yes.
bless them all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless the
Yep.
blondes and all the brunettes. And I can't remember how it goes anymore. Used to sing that at the Academy, Seth. Can you believe that? Um,
I could totally
not,
believe
I
it.
don't mean I used to sing it. We used to sing it. And so it was a popular song. I suspect they don't sing it there anymore. But this
Probably not.
raucous rendition, this was in Albany, Australia, which is on the southern coast around the bend from Perth, southwestern Australia. I know the place. And yeah, this hotel was kind of it was their version of the Pink Lady, the Royal Hawaiian in Pearl Harbor, where American submariners can kind of hang and 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 relax, although it wasn't anywhere near as nice
No,
as the
no.
Royal Hawaiian in Hawaii was, Seth.
No, no, and it's one thing, and we're going to sound like a broken record by the time we're done, but the one thing that Lockwood was famous and to a point infamous for was his protection and his concern about his crews. And I
Hmm.
mean from everything, from, friggin' toilet paper to R&R and everything in between. He was like laser focused on it, and this is no different. His subs are being sent out constantly on patrol, and the rest and recuperation, the R&R facilities in Australia, as you just noted, were few and far between, to say the least. He realized immediately that exhausted crews were of no use to literally anyone but maybe the Japanese. Lockwood set about fixing that problem as soon as he could, taking note from Nimitz's leasing of the Royal Hawaiian in Hawaii for subcrews. A lot of people have given that lease to Lockwood, saying Lockwood's the one that did it. No, it was Chester Nimitz who got the Royal Hawaiian to be leased to submariners. Why? Because Chester Nimitz was a submariner, so he also knew quite well. Lockwood tried to do the very same thing in Australia. He set up shop in Fremantle, and he immediately directed the establishment of two R&R facilities, one in Perth and the other one in the aforementioned Albany. Spartan accommodations were the norm, but something was better than nothing for the men who, until now, had quite literally nothing. The Aussies leased the quarantine station in Albany to the U.S. Navy, who in turn transformed the facility into something that the men could actually use. And while the R&R situation was important to Lockwood, that was not the top issue on his mind, was it, Bill?
It was not. The facilities in Australia were Spartan for U.S. submarines, to no one's fault, mind you, but sparse and Spartan all the same. Spare parts were non-existent. Remember, you could just fly these spare parts in when a pump impeller started leaking. You got the mechanical seal. You can't just get it off the tender. Because
No.
the different submarines had different pump types in. There was no standardization of pumps and valves and motors and things like that. It was a mishmash. And so you would have to special order parts that usually have to come in by ship, which meant you had to cannibalize other submarines to get the one who's supposed to go on patrol underway. By the way, this is still true when I was a junior officer at the end of Jimmy Carter's tenure when Reagan showed up. Reagan fixed the spare parts problem for us. That's another story. The bottom line is that he was struggling with issues from day one that he shouldn't have had to struggle with. He realized that despite the issues he was faced with, a really important issue that was surmountable, at least in his eyes, was the distance traveled by his crews to their patrol area. An issue he would wrestle with for the remainder of the war, by the way. He desired to establish forward operating base at Exmouth Gulf, an operation that he dubbed Operation Potshot. If you can get 800 miles closer or 700 miles closer to the war, that's ×2 round trip. You cut fuel consumption requirements, you cut time, you increase what's called the op tempo of your time on station compared to total time deployed. Everything gets better. So 700 miles north of Perth, this Exmouth was the answer to his problem. It would allow his boats to refuel there before going on patrol, thus extending their range. And while it was a great idea, it was short-lived as the Exmouth area was too far out in the wilderness to be completed or quickly or kept in supply by truck or ship or whatever. The idea was not Lockwood's alone, yet he kept this in mind really early and always looked for that perfect, what we would call in the modern parlance, FOB, forward operating base. And he would eventually run FOBs out of Midway, Saipan, Guam, later in the war, Seth.
Yeah, it was something that he was, because he was a submariner and he knew how the distance, the affected his patrolling area. That's something that you're going to see. I mean, you read anything about subs. Most of them they'd leave Pearl and they'd stop off at Midway to top off. And let guys go, get new guys aboard, ammo, whatever the case may be. And it happened over and over and over. And that was all Charlie Lockwood. That was all him.
Mm-hmm.
So through January 1943, Lockwood ran Com Sub So West Pack very efficiently and very well. His crews loved him, no surprise there, and he did everything in his power to keep them in supply and informed. And you mentioned the supply situation before, just briefly a second ago. And again, you got to remember the time of the war. It's let's just say June now, 1942, July maybe. Nobody's got nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's got squat. And for submarines, they really don't have anything. So, I mean, it was a constant battle. But many of the early successes of the submarine force in late 1942 and early 1943 were from Lockwood's Australian domain, including none other than Dudley W. Mush Morton, who took command of Wahoo in Australia. So that being said, by January, Lockwood's time in Australia was coming to an end, although neither he nor anyone else knew about it, Bill.
Yeah, that's right. Remember, we told the story of Mush Morton and how he did his PCO ride, prospective commanding officer ride, on Wahoo. And Richard O'Kane went up and told the Commodore, look, this Pinky Kennedy, I think was his name,
Yep.
skipper of Wahoo, he's got to go. And we happen to have this guy, Morton. It was a Commodore, but with Lockwood's approval, all of that magic
Absolutely.
happened.
Absolutely.
So now we're getting to Admiral Robert English, who was Com Sub Pack during this time in May 1942. In January 43, English, along with most of his staff, were set to go to San Francisco the same way that Nimitz would go to San Francisco to meet with King, by airplane. They were going to visit the submarine facilities at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where Seth and I, you were there. Was it last year? Was it? Yeah, it was last
Last
year,
year.
wasn't it?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
it
my
was.
goodness, time flies.
Yes, it
And
does.
Mare Island was either building, refitting, or repairing the majority of the Pacific Fleet's subforce. So obviously, that's why Admiral England wanted to visit the place. English, not England, English wanted to visit the place. English and his entourage boarded the Pan Am Clipper, piloted by a civilian crew. This is unlike Nimitz's amphibious airplane, where he almost died crashing into San Francisco harbor. So English and his crew is on board January 20th, with arrival set for January 21st. The flight across the Pacific was routine, but as it approached San Francisco, and I've landed a plane myself in San Francisco, by the way, with my parents on board. My mother's downstairs as we're recording this, and I lost my one and only engine on short final. That was the end of her flying career with me. But so English and his crew is approaching San Francisco. It's a pretty hairy approach. The Clipper ran into bad weather, high winds, a driving rain, and the ever-present San Francisco fog made the final leg of the flight perilous, and unfortunately for English, made it fatal. Due to the weather, the plane veered off course and was last heard from some 115 miles away from the airport, flying dangerously low, probably to sight, VFR stands, to varying degrees to, or IFR, I follow roads, right? They're probably looking for a road to follow back to the
Yeah.
airport.
Something.
Sadly, the airplane flew directly into a mountain at 3,000 feet, killing all 18 people aboard, including Admiral English. News of this disaster took time to filter through the network because they were hoping they would find them all alive as they searched for him. 8 days later, on January 31st, English's body was located. The news of his demise sent shockwaves through the small, close-knit submarine force. Upon news of English's death, Admiral King immediately moved to appoint English's replacement. To King, there was no decision to be made. To Lockwood, however, Seth, he had his doubts, didn't he?
He did. And Pearl Harbor was the last place on earth he wanted to go.
Mhm.
No lie, because he wrote a letter to his old friend, who at that time was a vice admiral named Edwards. He said, quote, and I direct quote from his letter says, I hope they never send me to Pearl Harbor, unquote. And this letter was sent, I kid you not, 2 days before he got his orders. He had no clue this was coming. To Pearl Harbor, he would most certainly go. However, initially, Lockwood said that his post in Perth was closer to the war, closer to the shipping lanes he had been assigned to sever, and the move to Pearl would put him farther away from that goal. And geographically, he was 100% correct. But tactically, he could not have been more wrong. One major glaring issue stared the new ComSub pack straight in the face when he got to Pearl, and actually it was even before then. And it was the weapon with which the submarines lived or died. Of course, we all know what we're talking about here. Before Lockwood ever even arrived in Australia or Pearl Harbor, he was keenly aware, all too keenly aware, of the issues with American torpedoes. According to Lockwood himself, he said, and I quote, apparently they were running too deep, deeper than the desired depth which had been set on the dial. Skipper after skipper reported seeing air bubbles trail pass under the stern of their targets. It was infuriating, unquote. Obviously, it most certainly is. Yet, while in Australia, Lockwood had not heard firsthand any of the issues with the torpedoes. He had merely read reports from skippers and read Buord's responses, which, as we all know, and we'll get into that in a minute, were pretty much, that's not my problem, it's your problem.
Mhm.
Lockwood needed firsthand accounts to wrap his mind around the issue. And this is one of the great things about Charlie Lockwood. He was a firm believer in the old adage that experience is the best teacher, and those who have experience, which he considered to be his subcrews, would have better knowledge of the issues at hand than those in Washington. Makes perfect sense, right? I mean, duh. I mean, when you think about it, that firsthand account that he needed came in the form of James Wigan Coe, who was captain of the USS Skipjack. Coe had just returned from a 50-day patrol of the South China Sea where his boat attacked Japanese ships to varying degrees of success and failure. Coe wrote in his report that, quote, to make an 8,500-mile round trip in enemy waters to gain attack position undetected within 800 yards of enemy ships, only to find that the damn torpedoes run too deep and over half the time fail to explode, seems to me to be an undesirable manner of gaining experience, unquote. Now, this is the same guy. God rest his soul. He was later killed. I forget which submarine he was killed aboard, but Cisco, I think it was. But Coe is the same guy who wrote the very snarky letter, the toilet paper letter. And Bill, I know you know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, which
Oh, I
is
do know the toilet paper letter. He
it's
sent a sample in
hysterical.
case in case the supply system didn't know what he was talking about.
It
He
is
sent a sample.
hysterical. And if you've ever seen the
It is.
movie Operation Petticoat with Cary Grant, they reenact
Mm,
that letter, but except for Cary Grant sends a letter. It's freaking hilarious. But
yeah.
anyway, Coe is the guy that really kind of kickstarted this. Well, Coe's report is the guy that really kind of kickstarted this action that made Lockwood go, all right, let's do something about this, Bill.
Exactly. Yep. So again, we talked about this before, but we're going to talk about it again with a little different spin. Lockwood decided to do his own tests. We talked about that. With Captain Jimmy Fife, who had initially suggested the test, Lockwood began his trials on June 20th, 1942. By then, not a single one had been tested, except in combat, which is not an operational test to be sure, but it's not repeatable. The aforementioned Coe was a primary tester, bringing skipjack to within 850 yards of a net that was set to a certain depth of the target. Every torpedo, they double checked, triple checked that the depth was set right in these torpedoes. Every torpedo fired by Coe ran too deep, 15 feet too deep, to be exact. Test after test after test was run with the same results. So, of course, at this point, Bureau is understanding the degree of the problem, right? Wrong. Recording the data religiously, Lockwood had the data sent to Bureau, along with the skipper's patrol reports noting the faulty fish. Crickets. The fight was just beginning. I've said this before in episodes. This was criminal malfeasance.
It's a travesty.
People should have gone to jail for this.
Yeah.
And I hold the current government and supplier base to the same standard, folks. When people start going to jail over issues like this, people will start treating them seriously. The mighty bureaucracy of Bureau was infallible, is the way Lockwood characterized it. They could not make a mistake. They did no wrong. They had the complete purity of vision of our Creator. They were completely infallible. They were all powerful. He knew he would have a serious fight on his hands. In less than 2 months, Lockwood had glaring evidence of the torpedo problems, yet again, in the form of Dan Daspit, the CEO of USS Tenosa, is the person who provided us the next bit of evidence. In July, Daspit had lined up the tanker Tonan Maru and fired 2 fish at her that exploded. Wounded but not dead, Daspit was actually lucky with these first 2. He lined up for the kill shot. Right, it was going to be on the money, perpendicular, exactly the way it should be, or so he thought. In an infuriating 13 torpedo fusillade, not one of the fish fired exploded, leaving Tonan Maru afloat and Daspin red hot. When Tenosa came into Pearl, as he always did, Lockwood was waiting for it. He boarded, talked with the crew, chatted with the officers, and took Daspit to his office where Daspit related his problems. Lockwood later said, I expected a torrent of cuss words, damning me, the Bureau of Ordnance, the Newport Torpedo Station, and the base torpedo shop. I couldn't have blamed them. 19,000-ton tankers don't grow on trees. I think Dan was so furious as to be practically speechless, Seth.
what can you say? I mean,
Yeah.
you fire 13 torpedoes, 13,
Mm.
13 torpedoes at a target, and not a friggin' one of them go boom. He saved the last one. He kept one in the boat to bring back to Pearl to say, "Look at this piece of crap.
Yep.
Tell me what do I do with this piece of junk?" That was easily the most glaring. I mean, there were multiple stories of failures with torpedoes, but that one, I mean, that's like the elephant in the room. It's like, good God,
Well,
13
and it was,
torpedoes at a
and we,
stationary
although
target, mind you, at a
right,
stationary target.
nobody knew it at the time. It's because he was able to take such care in lining up for the shot that they failed.
Yeah.
Because it turns out the shots that are done very rapidly and without a lot of preparation were the ones that were working. And they were about to learn why, Seth.
So Lieutenant Commander Daspit's report was the most recent and, as we said, extreme case of what had been a growing problem within the subfleet since the beginning of the war. From the first patrols after unrestricted warfare and all Japanese shipping had been ordered, which, by the way, was hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, submarine commanders had been complaining of torpedoes that failed to work properly. On December 14th, 1941, 1 week after Pearl Harbor, USS Seawolf encountered a Japanese freighter near the Philippines and fired 8 torpedoes. 7 missed, 1 hit, and failed to explode. So began the litany of problems with the Navy's technical marvel. Of course, this is the Mark 14 torpedo, and I say technical marvel. I'm being obviously very sarcastic. In the first months of the war, American submarines fired 97 torpedoes, and I'm just talking about like the first 2 or 3 months, 97 torpedoes at enemy shipping. Only 3 ships were sunk. Some failed to explode, while others, even though aimed with care, seemed to miss or run under their target. Even worse, several had blown up before hitting the side of a Japanese ship. The technical marvel that we're talking about was designed by engineers at the Navy Bureau of Ordnance. The Mark 14 torpedo, which of course what we're referring to, was built at Newport Torpedo Station beginning in 1926. 21 feet long, 21 inches in diameter, and weighing more than 3,000 pounds, the Mark 14s were large and very expensive. Powered by steam, they could run for 9,000 yards, which is about 5 miles, at 46 knots, which is a pretty good clip. They were extremely complex and required the most meticulous machine and assembly work. By 1940, they cost upwards of $10,000 each. Now, by 1940 standards, that is a chunk of change. That is a lot
Mhm.
of money. The most important component for the Mark 6 exploder was the Mark 6 exploder on the Mark 14 torpedo, without which the torpedo would be obviously absolutely useless. The certain way to sink a ship, as you've said a million times, Bill, is to break its back, which is to boom up underneath the keel. This often caused the ship to break in two. Obviously, this requires a torpedo to explode under the hull. To this end, Buord had designed the new exploder, this is a magnetic exploder, based on the successful British duplex and German magnetic mine designs. I don't know why I can't say magnetic today. Its most radical feature was the magnetic, I got it that time, influence exploder Project G53. It was a closely guarded secret, so much so that even a maintenance and operating manual had been written. It was never printed or distributed, Bill.
Yeah, so let's play this for you because I'm going to replay a line from the movie Apollo 13. If you saw the movie Apollo 13, true story, by the way, I'm looking at a Jim Lovell photograph right behind the camera here. Um, it says, Houston, we have a problem. But the line I want to use here is, can you tell me what on the spacecraft actually works? Right? The spacecraft, the explosion, right? And they're trying to get back home, and they're talking about all the systems that went down. And Gene Kranz says, okay, stop all that. Can you tell me what on the spacecraft actually works? In the case of this Mark 14 torpedo, you had a magnetic exploder that's supposed to sense the magnetic field of the ship as it passes underneath it and explode. You had an impact exploder. In case the torpedo slammed into the ship, the impact exploder would cause it to explode and go boom. Not optimum, but better than nothing. And you had a depth control system that caused it to run at the exact right depth. You would set the depth based on the the keel depth of the ship. You want it to run a little bit under the ship, but not too far under, so that the magnetic exploder was so deep that it wouldn't sense the magnetic field of the ship. It wouldn't explode. It's got to be right at the right depth. Okay, so 3 things. You would think that one of those 3 things on this Mark 14 torpedo designed by Buord would work. If one of those 3 things worked, you're probably going to be okay. And how many of these 3 things work? 0 of those 3 things work. They screwed up every one. Now, they were under a tight budget, like everyone else in the country in those days. They saw no reason to spend money on unnecessary testing.
Yeah.
We don't really actually need to know that these things work, do we? Only one test of the Mark VI was conducted in May 1926. And ironically, it was against the derelict submarine. 2 torpedoes were fired in this test. 1 worked, 1 didn't. Good enough for government work. They said, that's enough. We don't need to test anymore.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. Good enough for government work. A weapon with a 50% success rate was given the red stamp approval and was put into United States Navy submarines. And that's what we went to war with. So initially, Buord did, believe it or not, acknowledge the fact that there may be some issues, but Admiral Robert Christie, people always want to know, who's the guy? Who's the guy? Who's the guy? Well, it was a myriad of people who are to blame. However, if there is one figurehead who could probably be put upon the block, it would be Robert Christie. But that's neither here nor there. Robert Christie, who by then was an admiral, had worked directly on this very weapon system. So he was intimate with this weapon system. He took great pride in the weapon system, and he was the one who more often than not said, it's not my weapon, it's your guys, y'all suck. So he is the guy that would blame the skippers and the crews for lack of skill and bravery on their part. Now, you're going to tell that to Charlie Lockwood. He ain't going to stand for it. And that is exactly what he did. He flew to Washington, D.C., Charlie Lockwood did. He engaged in a heated discussion at Buord to the point where, from all reports, there was significant amounts of yelling back and forth in the presence of Admiral Ernest J. King, and uncharacteristically, Lockwood lost his cool. After being told to his face by Robert English that it was Lockwood's skippers that were performing poorly, he absolutely lost it. He said in a booming voice for all to hear, but especially Robert Christie, quote, if the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, or with a gun larger than a pea shooter, then for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off the target's side, unquote. The meeting ended shortly thereafter. Disgusted with the absolute lack of support, Lockwood decided to try another angle. In order to convince Buord that the problem was not with his subs, which he already knew, skippers or crews, but with the damn fish that they were given, he called in his ace in the sleeve, if you will, Commander Charles B. Momsen. Swede Momsen was his name, whose outspoken habit of going against the official grain had earned him very few friends in Washington, D.C., but Swede Momsen was one of the most innovative submarine engineers in the entire United States Navy. He had overseen the rescue of the crew of the USS Squalus after it sank off of Portsmouth in New Hampshire in 1939. He also was the guy that developed the Momsen lung, which of course was used by crew members of the USS Tang to get out of their sunken submarine. He was in command at this time of Submarine Squadron 2, Subron 2 at the time. Even after the Buord order, the reports of dud hits continued to pour in. Momsen, who had to endure the frustration of his skippers carrying useless torpedoes all the way to Japan for nothing, began to apply his engineer's mind to the solution. Swede Momsen isn't the guy we need to do an episode on, Bill. That guy was a freaking genius.
He was, yeah. Medal of Honor recipient, right? From the rescue. No, it wasn't him that got the Medal of Honor in Squalus rescue. But yeah, he led the whole thing, right? There was another submarine that got the Medal of Honor at Squalus. All right, so submarine commanders had been told that the best and most certain angle to fire a torpedo at target was perpendicular, exactly 90 degrees. That way you get a complete clean shot. broadside, to use the naval vernacular. Acute angles were less desirable because a glancing blow might, cause some kind of geometry issues. But it was, as was shown by Tenos's experience, that was exactly wrong. Daspit had fired 8 torpedoes at exactly 90 degrees, and not one had gone off. Ironically, the first 2 that he fired that morning after the long chase, they fired them at an acute angle just because that's all he could get on them. They both detonated, even though they struck the tanker hull, at a very non-optimum angle. Mommsen realized that the contact exploder's firing pin was being distorted whenever the torpedo hit head on. It was the deceleration forces slowed the pin's motion on its bearing. The spring failed to move it fast enough to set off the explosive charge, so on and so forth. He figured it out. What Buord couldn't do, this one dude and a few chief petty officers that worked with him figured it out. Examination of the primer showed hardly a dent, not nearly enough to ignite the warhead. The drop test showed that a glancing impact did allow. They did is angle a plate and then drop the torpedo vertically to make it like a glancing blow. Those did cause the firing pin to ignite the detonator. So Buord had made a small attempt to find a root cause of the problem by consulting some guy you might have heard of, Albert Einstein at Princeton University. The distinguished physicist examined the Mark VI torpedo blueprints and concluded that the firing pin was being distorted by the impact, exactly what was happening. He recommended that a void between the outer shell and the firing mechanism would eliminate the problem. But Buord believed that they were smarter than Albert Einstein, and he ignored.
You can't make that up. You cannot make this up.
And ignored his suggestion. And so all of that was, basically put on a shelf somewhere until Mommsen recreated the dynamic, right? The phenomenology, Seth, and proved that Einstein was right.
I mean, think about what you just said. Albert Einstein is the guy you told Buord's like, hey, y'all need to do this because this is what's happening. So if you do this, it'll probably work. And you're like, nah. You don't know what the hell you're talking about.
The smartest human being on the planet tells you something. You work for the government. So
I mean, seriously, you can't make that up. So, when you're talking about all this, anybody who's ever watched any World War II movies, and I don't mean to digress, but it came to me. The movie Operation Pacific with the Duke, with John Wayne, they run through all these. Of course, it's John Wayne who figures out the problem in the movie, but regardless of this, they run through these tests. They actually show how they did it and the whole deal, the drop test and the Pearl Harbor, they do it in Pearl Harbor, but the torpedo tests and all this other jazz. That movie, it's a really good movie. That movie, who was the technical consultant on that movie? Charlie Lockwood.
Charlie Lockwood. Yeah.
Just saying, check it out. If you haven't seen Operation Pacific with the Duke, check it out because it's actually more accurate than you would imagine. So Swede Mommsen showed the test results that he had been. Basically, Charlie Lockwood said, here, look, figure this out and call me when you have an answer. And that's exactly what Mommsen does. He takes the results to Lockwood. Lockwood then immediately doesn't even question it, takes it immediately back to Washington. He returned a few days later, as he said in his official war diary, quote, madder than hell, unquote. Buord finally admitted the exploder was at fault and committed to designing a new one. But here's the key, again, government work. That would take a year or more in the middle of a war. Then Mommsen told Lockwood that it should be possible to rebuild the contact exploder with different material. The exploder had to be both light and strong. Exotic alloys proved to be the key. Exotic alloys. The machine shop at the subbase obtained light alloys from, remarkably, melted down Japanese fighter that had been shot down at Pearl Harbor during the raid. New firing pins, springs, and guide tracks were machined and assembled from this Japanese fighter. The new
Hmm.
designs were tested and performed exactly as Mommsen hoped they would. Yet the project needed a lot more metal than one engine could provide. Another source was found at Hickam Army Airfield. Aircraft propellers had to be both light and strong. One Army Air Forces officer supposedly said, after being asked for as many damaged propellers as he could find, a better use for a busted prop could not be found anywhere, unquote. By the end of 1943, for the most part, the torpedo problem had been solved thanks to Mommsen's ingenuity and Lockwood's absolute bulldog tenacity. As 1944 dawned, Lockwood's pig boats were finally armed with a reliable, well, mostly reliable weapon, crewed with fighting bluejackets and led by incredibly brave skippers. The subwar, which had moved at a disappointing snail's pace from 42 to 43, would now finally pick up steam and would eventually break the back of the empire. Again, you can't make this stuff up, Bill. You can't.
No. How many of those 52 submarines would have survived had this problem been solved when it should have been solved, when the
Didn't
system
you
was
come to the
initially
conclusion that it
designed?
was like 10 or 12?
Yeah, 10. Yeah, I have the numbers downstairs. We
Yeah.
went through that in an earlier episode. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's 10 or 12. The times, 75-ish crew members per boat, right?
Hmm.
This is criminal. Um, some I think we had a commenter, a descendant of one of the persons who worked in Bue Ord during this time, saying that we were being unreasonably, offensively hard on these poor patriots who were sacrificing so much for our country. No, they weren't going to sea on submarines. I'm sorry.
We'll
How
tell that
many
to the Gold Star mothers. Yeah.
exactly? How much sooner would the war have ended? Because we're going to talk about the impact of the submarine force on the conduct of the war once they had a weapon that worked. As 1943 came to an end, Lockwood received a nice surprise via Nimitz, another star, and a promotion to vice admiral. The way Lockwood found out about his promotion was rather unique. As he often did, he met returning boats at Midway and rowed them back to Pearl Harbor. I did that sometimes with my submarines as well when I was Commodore. Not from Midway, though. Lockwood was a commanding officer who always had to be in the know, meaning he wanted firsthand descriptions of what had happened while the memories were still fresh, before they got distracted by being ashore and the the appealing nature of Waikiki and things like that would cause your memory to forget, not to mention the alcohol that would be consumed. So we catch them at Midway and essentially debrief them on the way back to Pearl Harbor. Lockwood rowed back with the crews, which is a trick Nimitz was not fond of, by the way, but he allowed his submarine boss to get his fun too. As Commander Chuck Triball's Snook, USS Snook, arrived in Pearl with Lockwood aboard, the boat and Lockwood were met by a full band on the pier, along with Lockwood's full staff. It was probably at Sierra 3 or Sierra 4, one of those piers that were still there when I was a junior officer that I pulled into at submarine base Pearl Harbor. He ignored the joke about the staff saying that, he thought that the band was there as a gag, right? Welcoming him ashore. Because normally, when the boats came in, they came in dirty shirt, which means they were wearing their dungarees and wash khakis. There was no band. There was no, really there was no whistle blowing. They came in quietly from patrol. They left that way too, by the way. Elated, but when he got there, he saw that there was a letter waiting for him from Nimitz, promoting him to vice admiral. Elated, he later said, "A vice admiral in charge of submarines? That's unnecessary, but I damn sure would take it." So he was happy about it. Now, interestingly, today, Subpac is a 2-star again. The reason for Uncle Charlie's promotion wasn't simply a nod either. It was warranted. He had fought the Bureau and won. He led his men to previously unrealized successes, and he was building on that successes that only accelerate in 1944. In 43, he sent more than half of his boat to Empire waters, installed radar, The use of ultra reports and obviously torpedo fixes shot the sinkings skyward. U.S. submarines in 43 sank 443 enemy ships for a total of 2.9 million tons. That's a 100% increase over 1942, Seth.
443 enemy ships. That's a lot of boats, man. Yet,
Yep.
as always is the case, success also brought loss. Japanese anti-submarine warfare got better and would continue to do so throughout the war. And as a result, twice as many boats were lost in 43 as were lost in 1942. Part of that was the fact that Lockwood cleared out a lot of dead wood, as he called it. Many of the pre-war, less adventurous skippers were recalled, and new, more aggressive men were in control. With aggression does unfortunately come loss. Now, this goes back to exactly what we said at the very beginning of this episode. He knew these guys. Like he knew these guys personally. He taught them at the academy. And when they're coming into Pearl, like you said, and like I said a few minutes ago, he'd get aboard the boats and ride in with them, or at the very least greet them at the pier, and he'd sit there and chat with them. And he'd go, and he wouldn't just, oh, how's the wife and kids? I mean, he'd go through everything with these guys. So he knew these people, and he knew them very well. He had an open door policy. Any skipper, any one skipper in his command could walk into his door and sit there and talk with him. But like anybody else, he's going to have his favorites. And one of those losses that he lost in 43 affected him more than any other one. And of course, that is USS Wahoo under the command of Lockwood's very, very close friend, Dudley W. Mush Morton. Mush was lost with Wahoo in October 1943. That loss absolutely devastated Charles Lockwood to his very core, both professionally and personally. He believed Morton to be the poster boy for the new type of submarine skipper that he was fielding: relentless, aggressive, and absolutely fearless. After Wahoo was overdue, Lockwood waited a full 2 weeks until all hope had vanished. He absolutely had to report her, quote, overdue and presumed loss. Wahoo's loss, and Morton specifically, would have a direct influence on the last major U.S. submarine operation of the war against Japan much later, and we'll talk about that at the end. 1943 had served as a transitional year. The silent service had learned how to fight, had the tools finally to fight the war, and the men to do it. 44 would be the backbreaker. Lockwood would see to that, Bill.
Yeah. And again, getting back to Morton, we of course have found the Wahoo, and the years since, we know where it is. We know how it was sunk, how it was lost. We have the Japanese reports as well confirming, but the underwater archaeology confirmed what the Japanese reports were true. And so we'll talk about where it was lost a little bit later, because other submarines would go through there as well. But in 43, Comanche, who's king, directed Lockwood to begin Wolfpack tactics. Now, Lockwood, by his own admission, knew it was a tactic he wanted to employ. In early 41, the submarine service experimented with Wolfpacks, attacking convoys in mock attacks from San Francisco to Hawaii routinely. But then, as in 43, but in 41, 42, and 43, the insufficient number of submarines caused the tactic to be abandoned. We couldn't cover as many geographic areas if we conglomerated, right, aggregated submarines into wolf packs. We would leave specific areas that needed to be guarded unprotected because we just didn't have enough boats. In 44, however, there were enough boats. So specific training for wolf packs began in late 43. With more boats coming in, it was obvious that 44 would allow the tactic to be born. Babe Brown, Lockwood's right-hand man and chief of staff, started at Lockwood's instruction what he called a convoy college for skippers. Based on what they had learned thus far, the best way to attack a Japanese convoy was known. While a single boat could successfully, to a degree, attack a convoy, When the convoy knew they were under attack, those ships in the convoy generally scattered like cockroaches when you turn on the lights. They were going in all kinds of different directions. That submarine could only track a few of them, right? Couldn't track them all. So maybe they could get one or two of the convoy once they knew they were being attacked, but most of the ships would get away, and they couldn't run all of them down. If you have a wolf pack, let's say a 15-ship convoy allowed for most, if not all, with 3 or 4 submarines in a wolf pack, so those submarines could be assigned quadrants. So as those ships scattered after they knew they were being attacked, the submarines would pursue ships in their assigned quadrant. And you can get a much higher percentage of the enemy ships than if you were by yourself. It was a simple tactic, but it worked like a charm. So under Lockwood's direction, American Wolfpack tactics were generally effective. Usually 4, sometimes 3 boats operated under one officer in tactical command, OTC, and which was one of the COs. Sometimes a division commander would ride one of the boats, and he would be OTC. But it was usually one of the 3 or 4 submarine COs who was the senior guy, would be assigned as he's still CO of that submarine, but he's also OTC of the Wolfpack. And in the beginning and middle of 44, many of these Wolfpacks were ahead of planned amphibious operations to clear out Japanese reinforcements, in other words, Japanese ground troops on transports, as well as to gather vital intelligence for the proposed beach landings. That's not to say that Empire patrols stopped. Those guys going after the lone ships or the merchant ships that were resupplying Japan. But as each new offensive gained steam, Flintlock, Forager, etc., Lockwood sent his boats out in ahead of the operation to clear the way, Seth.
Yeah, and it's something, you know, when we think about the submarine war in the Pacific, American submarine war in the Pacific, you always, and rightfully so, think of convoys being attacked, you know, in Empire waters, and obviously that is 100% true, but something that is not often thought of, and admittedly not often thought of for obvious reasons, is the fact that American submarines were indeed sent in ahead, not just to gather intel, like you were saying, like, you know, literally pop up the scope and take pictures of the beach, that kind of thing, but to go in there and sink Japanese reinforcements, ship convoys that were coming into the areas that we were going to attack. The subs would work in tandem with Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive. Wolf packs were sent to the Marshalls in January 1944, the Marianas in May and June 1944, Philippines all the time from August through October, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Direct support for the Central Pacific Drive is not something you generally think about when you think about ComSub Pack, but it's something that they absolutely did and executed to perfection. Case in point. In May 1944, Lockwood unleashed a wolf pack under the command of Leon Blair, CEO of Subdiv 44. Blair's blasters, as Lockwood called them, hit the Marianas with a 3-boat wolf pack: Pilotfish, Pintado, and Shark 2, all commanded by new skippers who happened to be all from the class of 1934. Sounds familiar, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Lockwood taught there from 33, 34, and 35, so he may have known these guys. Robert Close was on Pilotfish, Chick Clary was on Pintado, and Ed Blakely on Shark 2. The pack CO Blair rode with Clary on Pintado. Upon reaching their AOR, the pack immediately closed on a convoy of 5 ships. Attacks were successful, and the 3 boats spread out to chase the contacts via ultra, but stay within rendezvous range of each other. Between June 3rd through the 5th, the Wolfpack attacked 3 convoys together, nipping at the heels of the Japanese warships and picking them off piece by piece. Now, a lot of times when you think of a Wolfpack, you automatically think of the gray wolves in the Atlantic, the U-boats. And what would happen there, not all the time, but more often than not, is they would all attack within relatively close time proximity in the Atlantic. Not the case here in the Pacific. We would hit, like we were saying, in one quadrant, and then a couple 3-4 hours later, boom, it would get hit over here, and a couple 3-4 hours later, boom, it get hit over here. So the Japanese are constantly being picked at as they're moving down their lines. In the attacks, the American boats sunk at least 7 ships. Wartime records say 9, post-war records say 7. I think it was in 94, the U.S. Navy decided to go back to the wartime records and abandon what was called JNAC, which severely reduced a lot of the claims. The ships that were sunk were all bearing either men or equipment bound for the Marianas, either Guam or Saipan. The final convoy the boats attacked was virtually wiped out. 5 of the 7 ships were sunk and contained no less than half of the Japanese 43rd Infantry Division. Think about that. These 3 submarines wiped out almost, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less than half of an entire Japanese infantry division. We're going to talk about more. You're going to talk about more about that here in just a few minutes. With Forager bearing down like a freight train, Lockwood ordered a 4-boat wolf pack to the area again, but this time to save lives, not take them. Growler, Tenosa, Tarpon, and Pipefish all were on lifeguard duty, saving dozens of airmen during and after the June 11th raids on Saipan and Guam by Task Force 58. Following lifeguard duty, the boats with airmen aboard went out hunting. June of 1944, Bill, was a high point in warship kills for the Silent Service, though, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So Kavala and Albacore bagged Shokaku and Taiho, respectively. The contribution of Lockwood's boats to the Battle of Philippine Sea cannot be understated. The 2 submarines sank more than all of Task Force 58 in the largest carrier battle of the war. June itself was a huge month.
Say that again. Say that again.
Yeah, the 2 submarines by themselves sank more than all of Task Force 58 in the largest carrier battle of the war. June itself was a huge month for Lockwood's boats. 42 merchant ships plus 11 combatants were sunk, with Dick O'Kane's Tang taking top honors. For the Forager operation, thus far the biggest battle of the Pacific War, Lockwood had no less than 48 boats at sea in support. The boats, either in Mariana or Empire waters, all contributed to the success of Forager, with boats blocking exits from the Inland Sea and Tokyo Bay. Palau, San Bernardino Strait, Luzon Strait, these names sound familiar, as well as the entire east coast of Japan. Commander Submarine 7th Fleet under Rear Admiral Ralph Christie also contributed largely, but it was Lockwood's boys that carried the month for certain. By the end of 1944, Lockwood's boats, along with the 7th Fleet submarines, had accomplished incredible feats. Over 540 Japanese merchant ships were sunk in 44, totaling almost 3 million tons of shipping. Tankers had become priority number 1, along with pack fleet boats, resulting in 72 of their kind being put underneath the waves by Lockwood's boats alone. The tanker sinkings bled Japan to death beginning in 44, and such was the fear of American submarines amongst the Japanese that by the end of the year, most Japanese merchantmen resorted to slinking up the Korean or China coasts, where the seas were too shallow, in order to avoid the prowling pig boats. And while the merchant war, of course, of which the pig boats were designed to execute, was prosecuted to perfection, men of war also fell victim to the submarines. No less than 7 Japanese carriers of various types and sizes were sunk by submarines in 44 alone. 9 cruisers were also sunk, as well as the battleship Kongo. More than 30 Japanese destroyers were put on the bottom, as well as 9 Japanese submarines. Lockwood's boats were strangling the Japanese to death.
That's an astonishing number when you think about it again. 7 Japanese aircraft carriers of varying types and sizes were sunk by American submarines in 1944 alone. 7. Goodness gracious. So 1944 had been tremendously successful for Lockwood. Success had come at a high price, though, as the Japanese, yet again, not surprisingly, stepped up their ASW game, and the changing strategic picture of the war forced Lockwood to adjust. With eyes set on an invasion of Japan, Lockwood was preparing officially for what his boats had been doing for over a year, which was a blockade of the empire. Concepts had to be redrawn as the shrinking AOR for Lockwood's boats caused issues. Now, and I say that officially, and I use that with air quotes because that was an official thing that was discussed. That was a United States Navy tactic, I guess, proposed tactic, was to blockade the island nation of Japan before an invasion. Hopefully, we would be able to strangle them out with a blockade or starve them out with a blockade, so we wouldn't have to invade. So we were preparing for this, although technically we had been doing it successfully since late 1943. After each advance made by the Americans in the Pacific, the patrol areas for Lockwood's boats were cut down or cut out altogether. The lone wolf submarine tactics of 42, 43, and early 44 were no longer viable, frankly. Cooperation with the fleet was more vital than ever, and support for operations in the future were the absolute target. Sinkings, too, by 1945 had become rare. Not that the subs didn't score, because they did, but the big scores of 1944 were not to be found nearly as often. For example, in February 1945, only 14 Japanese ships were sunk. That is not because we didn't have enough submarines out, quite the opposite. We had more out than we probably needed to have out. It's just that there were that few targets. Lockwood set 3 goals for sub-pack fleet in 1945. First was the training of new officers and crews to use the new tech that was coming into the fleet. Lockwood had worked directly with Buord, now that the torpedo fight had been won, he'd made friends with him, to push the development of depth charge evasion equipment and new sonar and radar sets for the boats. Radar, in particular, had been a game changer for the submarines in 1944 and would play a large role in the success of 45 too. Second, with the strategic bombing campaign over Japan underway at full throat and U.S. Navy carrier raids on the home islands taking place more regularly, lifeguard stations and patrols became even more important. Lockwood stressed and got closer cooperation with LeMay's Bomber Command and was key in the deployment of better communication equipment for his boats to facilitate rescue operations. During the war, the entire war now, a total of 86 American submarines rescued some 504 Army, Marine, and naval aviators, the vast majority of which were rescued in late 1944 and 1945. The morale influences of those rescues by the American submarines cannot be understated, Bill.
Yeah. The third mine detection gear was a huge priority for Lockwood. He felt that several of his boats had been lost to mines. He thought that Wahoo, for example, had been lost to mine and was adamant that equipment be developed to search for, locate, and avoid those mines. He noted that location and destruction of enemy mines would also play a huge and important role in the upcoming invasion. To this end, frequency modulated or FM sonar was developed and tested by early 45 by USS Tunney CO George Pierce. The FM sonar set was very temperamental, and work on it would continue under Lockwood's eye once he transferred his command to Guam, as did Nimitz, remember. Throughout March 1945, Lockwood worked on the FM sonar with Tunney. Professors from the University of San Diego came out to Guam to assist with the temperamental equipment that had thus far not proven to be reliable. You do not want to go into a minefield with gear that doesn't work. By the end of the month, due to Lockwood's persistence and personal intervention, the FM sonar sets were declared a success, and deployment to the fleet boats began, albeit too late in most cases as the war ended soon. Now, what's a success? You detect 90% of the mines, but you don't detect 10. Is that a success? That's about what we're talking about here. So imagine, that 1 out of 10 mine your system's not going to see that might kill you, and you're being asked to go into a minefield like that. That was what was happening. That was good enough. The risk-reward ratio was good enough for stuff like that. After the successful installation of FM on Tunney, Lockwood requested permission from Nimitz to ride her to the Sea of Japan to penetrate a minefield, to observe it, to see if it worked. Uncle Charlie promised his boss, I'll be back in 10 to 12 days. To absolutely no one's surprise, Nimitz refused. He sent Lockwood a message that read, "Sorry, Charlie. Are you sure it wasn't the USS Tuna?" Where he said, "Sorry, Charlie." The answer must be no. It was the Tunny, not the Tuna. So people of a certain age will get that joke.
Oh, I remember that.
You got it. Okay.
I did.
FM sets were installed on Tunny, Spadefish, and Tenosa. Lockwood's experimental boat, Tunny, made the first successful penetration and charting of a minefield underwater when she located and charted 222 mines. By the way, we were still trying to do this when I was on submarines with limited success, by the way, folks. We were saying, oh boy, we're taking a nuclear submarine to a minefield. Yes, we do that, folks. Still, work on the FM sets continued. Lockwood had his eyes on penetrating the Sea of Japan and the Tsushima Straits, a hunting ground he felt was rich with targets. Tsushima Straits to the south of Honshu. We're going to talk in a minute about La Perouse Straits to the north of Hokkaido, between Hokkaido and Sakhalin Island. I've been through both. La Perouse is where we lost Wahoo. For weeks, Lockwood had been building up to the dangerous and bold enterprise, as he called minefield penetration. Test after test was run on the FM sonar, as he was still not solid on the product despite early successes. Japanese radar countermeasures had confounded submarines since early 44. And due to Lockwood's insistence, ultra short-wave radar sets were now being installed on fleet boats because they were not detectable by the Japanese radar detection equipment. So you could get in there with an ultra short-wave radar and they wouldn't know you were coming because they couldn't detect. Remember, they can detect your radar twice the range that you could detect them with the radar, okay? So this is why it's important not to be detected. Development of deployable decoys to aid in the evasion of ASW vessels were tested under his eye upon his landing at San Diego in April 1945. These deployable decoys simply were like used hydrogen to create big gas bubbles in the water. So active sonars would get a reflection off, an acoustic reflection off the gas bubble, and hopefully would mistake that thing that they got the reflection from for the submarine as you kind of eased your way out of there. Doppler was the giveaway here, though. If you had Doppler, that meant the target was moving, which meant it probably wasn't the gas bubble. So you're looking for targets with Doppler. And so these countermeasures were developed. The gadget was a success, but was deployed too late in the war to be of any use. The FM sonar was again tweaked, and new torpedoes were being tested. Remember, we deployed the Cutie during this time, the Mark 18s during this time, while he was in San Diego for 2 weeks. Early results were promising, according to Uncle Charlie, Seth.
Yeah, he flew later that month. He flew to Washington, where he spoke before a joint committee of Army and Navy and won approval for the production and deployment of 24 ultra shortwave radars. I cannot talk today. SV radar is what it was called, and 25 FM sets, all ready for installation by September 1945. Obviously, we know what happened in September. Even with the war on the ropes, Charlie Lockwood continued and never stopped working for his crews. With what FM sets he did have, however, which were mostly field made, Lockwood initiated what he called Operation Barney, the penetration of the Japanese minefields. Placed under the command of Commander Earl Heidemann, they were code-named Heidemann's Hellcats. These are going to be 3 different wolf packs that are going to go out there. The force was divided into these 3 wolf packs, each with its own area of AOR. Heidemann's Hepcats, consisting of the Sea Dog, the Crevalle, and the Spadefish. Pierce's Polecats, commanded by Commander George E. Pierce and consisting of Tunny, Bonefish, and Skate, and Risser's Bobcats, commanded by Commander Robert D. Risser, consisting of Flying Fish, Bowfin, and Tenosa. As Lockwood said, and I quote, "We wanted to finish the job and sink everything left that flew a Japanese flag," unquote. The Hellcats crept through the minefields blocking the Tsushima Strait, southernmost of the three entrances to the Sea of Japan, on 4 through 6 June 1945. Once inside, and again, this is key because this is the first time American submarines had penetrated the Sea of Japan since Wahoo had done it in October 43. They discovered a submariner's dream. Unescorted merchantmen steering straight courses with running lights aglow and aids to navigation burning brightly. The Japanese never thought we'd be back in there. Skippers were sorely tempted to disregard orders to delay attacks until sunset on June 9th, but discipline prevailed. Why did they want to delay attacks? Because we wanted to get as many submarines into that area as we possibly could. And if we started sinking them before everybody got in there, the Japanese would know that something was amiss. There was a rat in the woodpile. Between the quote commence firing and 20 June, the Hellcats conducted one of the submarine war's most productive patrols, sinking 27 Japanese merchant vessels and one submarine, the I-122, for a total of 54,786 tons. They also sank a big Soviet freighter for an accidental 11,000 tons more. The Soviet freighter was an unfortunate friendly fire accident, if you will. Heideman's Sea Dog emerged as the top scorer with 6 ships sunk. One boat, Commander Lawrence L. Edge's Bonefish, was unfortunately lost. As prearranged, the other Hellcats ran through La Perouse Strait under the cover of darkness on June 24th. Elated by the outcome of Operation Barney, Lockwood promptly sent 7 more subs into the Sea of Japan, where 6 were on patrol on VJ Day, Bill.
Mm-hmm. So for Uncle Charlie, Operation Barney's success was vindication of his hard work. He said he felt a tidal wave of triumph at the successes. He recalled, "I had gambled much. Even the blue chips of my professional standing, not to mention a whole bunch of submarine lives, on the ability of the FM to pick the lock and open the doors that kept our submariners out of the heavily mined waters." In truth, Lockwood wanted to penetrate the mined waters of the Sea of Japan because he believed Wahoo and his good friend Mush Morton had been lost to mines in the area. As it turns out, they hadn't been. They were sunk by aircraft. But he said later, "I felt that the dauntless spirit of the Hellcats and of Dudley Morton's Wahoo was with me when I reported their success to Admiral Nimitz. Now I could say in sadness and pride, go with God, Wahoo." Lockwood's sentiments were heartfelt, but the Hellcats' mission of vengeance had come at a high price. The loss of 85 submariners on Bonefish, which was sunk in the operation. And while the scalps taken were high, the loss of another sub so close to the end of the war hung over the operation. The one plus that could be taken away from Barney was the FM sonar, which proved to be a game changer. While Lockwood's mission to the Sea of Japan may have been more sentimental than strategic, we didn't know how long the war would last. So he needed to do this. And the FM sonar he worked so hard to deploy eventually did avenge his beloved Wahoo. In 2005, using FM side scan sonar, as I said earlier, a wreck of a submarine was found in La Perouse Strait. Footage of the wreck confirmed its identity. Wahoo, Uncle Charlie, had won after all. Now, Seth, I had to look it up here. When we post this video, we'll have 160 episodes of the unauthorized history of the Pacific War on YouTube. 160. Okay? And of those 160 episodes, I would say 150 of them covered battles that
You're probably right.
were glorious and very important to the conduct of the war. And maybe 10, I'm guessing, on submarines. Um,
Close, maybe.
yeah, how did I let that happen, Seth? And it's not that these 150 other non-submarine episodes shouldn't have been covered. They absolutely should have. But and here's the thing that I hinted at the beginning. It's beware of historians who can do math. Seth, are you one of them?
No, I am not.
Yeah.
I fully admit
But Rich Frank can
is.
do math. And Rich Frank said to me, oh, maybe 6 weeks ago, something that blew my mind. Has he said this to you too, Seth?
He did. Yeah. Yeah. But
And what he
I'll let you
said
take the
was,
honors. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yes.
what he said was that it should be revealed at this conference in San Diego around the time this episode airs. Submarines killed more Japanese than the entire United States Marine Corps. Okay? I knew submarines had a pretty significant impact on conduct and the victory, but I had never seen anybody do that math before. And this is going to be very controversial. So again, I want to say that I haven't validated Rich's numbers, but I trust him. He's
Oh God.
a
Yeah.
very reputable historian. I mean, he wrote
Yeah.
the book on Guadalcanal, which is, the Marines would claim is about them, and so he's no one to lean against the Marine Corps. He's a lover of the United States Marine Corps. And to my knowledge, this is going to. Uh, I don't know anyone else that's published numbers like this. Do you, Seth?
No, and I mean, Rich is the grand poobah. That's what I've called him
Right.
for years now of Pacific War historians. He's the man. And if Rich says this is what happened, then everybody else goes, yes, sir. This is what happened.
Yeah.
And when he said that, you had told me that he told you that about 4 days before I saw him last, which was in New Orleans,
Mm.
and he told me he reiterated the same thing to me, and it's rather shocking. Uh, Revelation, I guess, is a better way to put it.
Hmm.
And only somebody like Rich could come up with that kind of number, and everybody go, "Wow!" But yeah, no,
Yeah.
he's going to reveal that in his lecture, and he's going to come on here. He's going to come on here hopefully soon, and we're going to
And
talk
go
about this
through the
very
numbers
same
with
thing
us.
again. Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He's going to go through all that, stitch by stitch, number by number with us. But and he's an amazing guy, but one of my
Yeah.
good friends and mentors for sure. But back to the subject of the episode, Uncle Charlie. Uh, again, what I said in the intro holds true. People talk about Nimitz and Spruance and Halsey and whoever as being these, admirals who led the way to Tokyo Bay, and they did to a degree, obviously, but they had a hell of a lot of help. And it was from this dude here that we did this episode on, Charles Lockwood. He's a guy that, again, he wasn't out for the limelight. He wasn't out there making headline, quite the opposite. There's a reason they were called the Silent Service, many reasons, but one of them was is they didn't get the headlines that everybody else got. And that's probably part of the reason why Charlie Lockwood, I don't want to say he's forgotten by any means, but he hasn't gotten the recognition that he deserves, is because the submarine service was the silent partner, the silent killer of the Pacific War. And there is no doubt that under his, and of course, ComSub and the Seventh Fleet, they're doing their own thing and they're obviously contributing greatly too. But there's no question Charles Lockwood was the man who ran the submarine Pacific War for the United States. And he was the guy that really put the vast majority of the pressure on Japan's throat, beginning from the day he took office in Pearl Harbor until the end of the war when he's standing on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Charles Lockwood probably, arguably, was the most effective American admiral outside of Chester Nimitz of the entire war. And I'd stand by that argument. I really would.
I would too. And I say this as a lover of Spruance, but the numbers just don't lie.
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
numbers
just
don't lie,
they don't
man.
know
Yeah.
lie. And I'm a metrics guy. I was an engineer back when I could do math. And so if Rich Frank's numbers are real, this is headline stuff. And I believe they are. I believe him. And, it may piss some people off, but facts are facts, and it shouldn't. And so I'm with you, Seth. He made a huge impression. These days, the submarine force makes news because of the poor job the Navy's doing producing submarines. But outside of that, operationally, you almost never hear a peep. So operationally, the old joke was SEALs, they do those secret missions. Yeah, and then they write a book about it. So everybody knows what the heck they did, right? The SEALs aren't secret anymore. My SEAL friends, Bob Harwood, sorry, but it's the truth. Uh, Submarines are. They're the silent service again. And they're better for it. I'm glad about that. Because in a future war, they have the opportunity to make the same kind of impact that Charlie Lockwood and his submarine force made in World War II. I go back to my episodes called Captain Toadie's Pearl Harbor and look at when I go into Skipper's Lounge in Lockwood Hall. I spent so many hours in that room with those photographs hovering over me, Charlie Lockwood's skippers from when I was an ensign to when I was Commodore, inspiring me at every level of my submarine service. Every
Building the
one of my
shoulders of giants, man.
shoulder of giants. Every one of my 7 deployments, yes, 7 deployments over the course of my Navy career. Those guys were looking over my shoulders. That's the way I looked at it, right? And so, even on 9/11, I knew as it was happening that this is our Pearl Harbor. And I wanted to, do what I could. I knew that no matter what I did, I wouldn't hold a candle to what those dudes in those pictures in the Skipper's Lounge of Lockwood Hall had done. And so they continue to be an inspiration to me. They should be an inspiration, not just for every submariner, but for every American military man and woman. Go back, selfless sacrifice, fighting above your weight class, right? That's what everybody needs to do today and in future wars. Seth, well, it's good that we did this.
Oh, yeah, it was overdue. But I mean, again, I just want everybody who's watching or listening to think of this. More than half of the Japanese ships sunk by the United States Navy in World War II were sunk by the United States Navy submarines. That's everything. More than half were sunk by U.S. Navy submarines. So in 1945, when the Japanese were starting to starve, and they were quite literally starting to starve, yes, there were certain aspects of the strategic bombing campaign that played into that. Yes, there were certain aspects of the mining campaign that carried on by the B-29s that factored into that. But the United States Navy submarines have been doing this since 42 and technically effectively since 1943. They were the major reason. They were the major reason. So their contribution cannot be understated. And this is not by any means the last episode we're going to do on submarines. We actually Bill sent me and I don't want to spoil it, but you sent me a link to something that is just freaking cool. So we're going to do a really cool episode on a very special submarine mission here in the I don't know, whenever next few weeks, whenever the hell we get around to it. But yeah, it's an aspect of the war that I know is near and dear to your heart, and definitely something we need to explore more, and we will here in the near future. Bill, is there anything else you want to say about Uncle Charlie before we wrap it up?
No, I'm just happy he's buried where he's buried,
Yeah.
next to Chester Nimitz
Yep. Yep. Well,
and Ray
with that,
Spruance. Yep.
yeah, with that, we want to say thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. We certainly do appreciate it. If you got a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And apparently, I guess, Bill, in January, after we last did our Q&A with John, I can't talk anymore. So I apologize for me stumbling over my own words. I don't know what the hell is going on, but here it is. So with yeah. So anyway, so I'm just going to close out now before I stick my foot in my mouth anymore because I can't talk. So once again, my name is Seth Peart, and thank you very much for listening and or watching. Bill, bring us home.
And as we're recording this, we went over 9 million views. Thanks to all of you for that. And we'll see you again next week.